All right, so the next concept we're going to take a look at is the concept of self esteem, how we feel about ourselves. Self esteem, according to social psychology, is an evaluation of self. And this can be either a positive evaluation of self or a negative evaluation of self. You could think you're fairly incredible, right? Or you could think you're a worthless piece of trash. Uh, your thoughts about self esteem are uh, what will give it its positive or its negative connotation. And so there are two different types of self esteem that psychologists will look at. One is what's called trait self esteem. And trait self esteem is looking at all those things that make you who you are. If you remember talking about the social self, the talents and skills that we think we have, and making a judgment about our self esteem based on those things. So I am very intelligent, or I'm very athletic, or I am very kind, or very compassionate. Those things that we see as more permanent parts of who we are make up trait self esteem. This is a more enduring measure of self esteem. So it's the idea that this is going to last a long time. It's harder to change or manipulate trait self esteem. That's something that gets set fairly solidly. And so that can be a good thing if it's very positive, but it can be something to overcome if ultimately that trait self esteem is a negative evaluation of who you are. We also have what's called state self esteem. And state self esteem is how we're feeling right now. And so you're having a particularly great day. You hit all the traffic lights on the way to school. You aced a quiz that you had first hour. All your homework's done. You feel like you look really good in the outfit that you chose. That is going to give you very positive in the moment self esteem. Right? Those things that are around you are telling you that what's going on is very positive. Same thing can happen though in the moment if you get a ticket, a traffic ticket on the way to school. You fail that quiz. Somebody, your boyfriend or girlfriend breaks up with you. And so those things can lead to, in the moment, a very negative self-esteem. Now, again, this is just something that's happening really based on the circumstances around us at that particular point in time. So it's something that can change very quickly. So it's not like trait self-esteem, which is a kind of the solid foundation that we're based on. This is very much kind of in this particular time. This is how I'm feeling about myself. So there are a lot more swings that will happen with state self-esteem than happen with trait self-esteem. So, what is self esteem? So, theoretically, I've got a link here for you, and I'm going to link it on the modules. I'd like for you to pause what you're doing to go and to take this self esteem assessment that's there, and then you're going to screenshot that and upload it for me. I'll get you some points for doing that, but it'll give you an idea. It's real short, it's about 10 questions, I think, that ask you to rate yourself on a scale. So, the number you pick will have an effect on what you're doing, but it'll give you just kind of a simple self-esteem assessment that you're going to notice. Okay, now that you've hopefully paused the video and gone and done that, or you can do the self-esteem assessment, I guess, after we get done. There are a couple of other things we want to look at when we look at self-esteem and self-worth. One is what is called the contingency of self-worth. And it's the idea that our self-esteem rises or falls based on our success with certain tasks. And so if there's something that we think we're really good at or should do well at, and we don't perform as well as we think we should, that can lead to a drop in self-esteem. On the other hand, if there's something we didn't feel like we were really good at, but we do better than expected, that can lead to a rise in self-esteem. And so, what the two theorists here are looking at is the idea that our ideas about what should happen have a great impact on how we feel about ourselves and our behavior. And you can probably think of things like that, right? Where you thought things weren't going to go very well, but then it does, and we get a little bit of an ego boost from that. Where at the same time, if there's something that you were normally really good at, but it didn't work out the way you thought, that can be a blow to that self-esteem. The sociometer hypothesis uh, proposes that our self-esteem is based on our standing with other people. And so, if you go by this theory, it's not necessarily what we think about ourselves that makes up our self esteem, but it's what we think other people think about us. This one, I think, probably speaks to people in different stages of life. Maybe younger, you guys may be looking and thinking, maybe more of a middle school type of situation where we're much more concerned about what other people think about us. And this doesn't necessarily have to be they look at you and say, hey, I think you're wonderful, or I think you're a piece of trash. This could be just what we think somebody else thinks about us can have an effect on the way we feel about ourselves. Now, hopefully, when you look at this is something that doesn't have as much influence the more you grow and the more you learn, because this is going to be much more volatile, right? The idea that we're relying on others' opinions of us to define who we are. I would say this is probably not a very healthy way to go about defining self and basing your self-esteem. But again, the sociometer hypothesis says that we base our self-esteem on how we feel like we stand with other people. So, if you want to be a positive person, right? If you want to have good self esteem, if you don't want to be wearing the t shirt like this guy in the slide, what do you do? Well, there are some things that you can do. Our brains have what is called the better than average effect, where for the most part, when we're asked to rate ourselves in certain things, we will, even at things we're not very good at, we will rate ourselves at average or just a little bit better than what the average person can do. So we kind of start from the assumption that if we give our effort and our ability to something, that we are going to be at least in the top 50% of people who are doing this, right? We're going to be a little better than the average person would do there. We also have what's called a self-evaluation maintenance model, where with certain tasks, we will do certain things. If it's a task that we're not very good at, we will reflect on that, and then a lot of times we'll base our self-esteem based on friends or family we have that are good at that. So if you don't feel like you're a very good public speaker, but you have a friend who is a very good public speaker, and you see that person giving a speech, we can actually draw some positive self-esteem just from the idea that, hey, I'm friends with this person who has this particular skill set. Now, for that to work, it's got to be something that's not one of those core things that you feel like defines you. Because when somebody else is good at something that we feel like defines us, then we have more of a tendency to compare ourselves to that person. And that can be either a positive or a negative. I remember being a senior in high school and being up for a scholarship. And part of the scholarship was the finalists had to come and to give a speech. Well, I was always one of those people that I was going to set the bar. I wasn't going to jump over a bar someone else set. And so what I did is I volunteered to go first. Well, because I volunteered to go first, that meant that the other 9 people, I saw them give their speeches. And I came out and thought I'd done a pretty good job and felt very confident that I was going to, I'd done better than average, right? Well, the next kid that came out was a champion speech giver, like literally had won competitions in this and blew me out of the water. And so as I looked, kind of comparing myself to that guy, it was not going to be a positive comparison that was happening. Now, a lot of times what we'll do, though, is we will self-verify the things that we think we're good at. And so we're kind of constantly reevaluating where we fit in and where these particular skills fit in. And we want to try and be as accurate as we can because any kind of switch in these things can influence our self-esteem. And so you don't want to go too, especially I think probably the temptation would be to go overboard about how good you are at one particular thing or another. And so you don't want to do that because um, any kind of change in this is a change in one of those core principles or values. So what drives us once we've got self-esteem set, and once we understand who we are, we have what psychologists say is a drive to be better. If you remember, in 101 we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and this idea that we want to self-actualize, right? We want to become the best that we can be. Self-regulations fits in with that. We have this idea of possible selves, and it's kind of we cast this vision out as to who we can be. And this is something that doesn't necessarily stop the older we get. Obviously, this is a big deal. When you're the age you guys are, right? As just kind of your future's laid out in front of you, you're having to make some decisions about schooling and what you want to do and what you want to be. But this could really be for anybody. And so it's kind of like you start at one place, but you've got this image of where it is that you want to end up. So what this leads to is something called self-discrepancy theory. And self-discrepancy theory says that we have three ideas that are bouncing around in our head, right? We have what is called the actual self, which is who we know ourselves to be right now. But the actual self competes a lot of times with two other ideas of self, right? You have what you see there in the yellow, the ideal self, who you would ideally like to be, right? So this is kind of your vision of your goal, right? Where you want to end up, the type of person you want to be. Now you got to be careful though, because if you really latch onto that idea of the ideal self, this self-discrepancy theory says that this can lead to depression because you get bummed that you can't live up to this ideal expectation of who you want to be. Maybe you want that ideal self, but it's just maybe unattainable, or it's not attainable right now, and you don't want it to be something that's going to have negative consequences. You also have what's called the ought self. So you look at that orange down at the bottom, and it's who other people think you should be. And so this is, again, going back to that stuff we were talking about with self-concept, this image that other people have of us, parents, spouses, people like that tells us this is who we ought to be. And when we can't meet the ought self, right, when we can't live up to that expectation, then that can lead to anxiety and can be something that is negative again, right? If you let either one of those, who other people think you should be, or this ideal vision of who you think you should be, if you let those get too far out in front of the actual self, there can be some negative consequences there. Self-handicapping is another type of technique we use to regulate self-esteem. Self-handicapping is self-defeating behavior to excuse possible future failure. So self-handicapping is almost where we make excuses for why we won't live up to our own expectations or other people's expectations. And so if you remember talking about self-fulfilling prophecy and the idea that when we think these things, a lot of times we can make them come true, the same thing comes with self-handicapping, in that we look and we want to have an excuse for what happens if we don't live up to these expectations. And so it's almost a defense mechanism, right? Something that's built in to keep us from having to deal with these big disappointments that can come along with failure. The last one we've got here is the idea of communication. I don't know about you, but a lot of times I find myself in kind of an inner monologue with myself, talking to myself about things I need to do, how I did something in particular, things that I would like to see or to change, those sorts of things. And if you don't feel that way, don't tell me, right? Maybe I'm the only person, but I'm willing to bet I'm not. And we can have what are called on the record and off record communications with ourselves. It's almost things that we say out loud or we say to other people are on the record communication. And then off the record communication are kind of these internal thoughts and feelings that we have that we don't necessarily share or we don't necessarily spend a lot of time mulling over ourselves because um, we're wanting to maintain this stability of self that we've managed to create. And so all of these things, right? I mean, if you think about it, right, just looking at this little bit of self-esteem, it's sometimes very self-driven, but we can turn that power over to other people to influence our self-esteem. We've got these defense mechanisms that we come up with to help avoid big swings in what our self-esteem is. But the more complex we can make ourselves, kind of the more safeguarded we are. So the more areas where you look and are very genuine with your thoughts and feelings about how you particularly rate, then the better off you're going to be as you try to control self-esteem.